Okay, we're good. Awesome. So we're live on YouTube and we're recording here. So before we hand things over to Rick and Susan, my name is Christine Kwong and I'm the EdTech consultant for the Edmonton Regional Learning Consortium. I'm just going to go over a few basics about the Zoom platform. And so to start with, you might want to change the view options on your screen. The default is to be in full screen. And so what that means is when Rick is sharing his presenter slides, you won't be able to see the participant window or the chat window. So you can just hover over the bottom of your screen and you'll see a toolbar that comes up. And at the bottom of the page, you can see that there's a mute button and a stop video button, but there's also the options to open up that chat box on the side. And there's also the option to open up a participant window. So Rick, if you could go to the next screen. This will just talk briefly about using your microphone. So proper etiquette in the webinar is to leave your microphone muted while you're not speaking. Otherwise, we might pick up a lot of background noise on our end. And so when Rick is talking, mute those microphones. And then if he asks you to speak, you can unmute them by hovering over the bottom of the screen, clicking that microphone button to turn your mic on. There's also a shortcut if you want to hold down the space bar on your keyboard. You can hold that down and speak as well to temporarily mute yourself. And then if you would like to start or stop your video, you have that video icon, again, if you hover the bottom left of your screen to turn that on and off so we can see you or not see you. Thanks, Rick. And then the participant window is where you can see who else is joining us in the webinar. You can also see next to your name, you can see Wanda's at the top there, but I can see next to hers that her microphone is gray and her video is gray. That means those both things are turned on. But if you look at Kit Buckingham at the bottom there, the microphone in the video has an cross throughout it. That means theirs are turned off. And then you also have some options at the bottom of that window to interact during the webinar. So if Rick is saying something and you want to let him know, yes, you agree with that, you can click that icon with a yes. Another helpful button is the more. There's some features there where you can click an icon just to let us know if you need to step away from the computer for a moment to take a phone call or whatever it may be. Just helps us out if we're trying to interact. Thanks, Rick. We can go to the next one. And just to let you know, we are recording in the Zoom and the live stream. And so we have some people joining us on YouTube. We have a few in there right now. And so your consent to be recorded on those platforms is by you staying in the room. Of course, if you want to have some more privacy, there are a couple of things that you might want to consider doing. One is you can change your name. So a lot of people have their first and last name to get into the room so we know who you are for security reasons. But once you're in the room, you can hover over the thumbnail of your photo and click the 3 dots. And from there, there's an option to rename yourself. So some people might choose just to put their first name only or their initials. That's fine. Again, it is nice to keep your camera on just to have be able to see faces within the meeting. But if you don't want that recorded, you might choose to turn that off as well. Thanks, Philip. I see you popped yours on there. Oh, and the other thing is, if you aren't comfortable with being recorded, you also have the option to go to that live YouTube link that we sent out to you. And if you're viewing that way, you wouldn't be in the recording for sure. So I am going to turn things over to Susan.
Great, thanks Christine for that introduction. So if any point during the webinar you have any tech-related questions, please feel free to message Christine in the chat. Hi and welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Susan Wu, an educational consultant for the Edmonton Regional Learning Consortium, and I'm also representing the Alberta Regional Professional Development Consortia. We are excited to have the opportunity to be reflective about today's learning through the webinar Assessment and Grading to Support Learning at Home, Burning Questions with Rick Wormelli in the hot seat. This session is intended for Alberta educators who have already participated in any of Rick's previous webinars for ERLC's 3-part Assessment for Supporting Learning at Home series, and would like clarification on any of the previous webinar content. If you happen to have missed any of these webinars, these have been recorded and you can find them on ERLC's YouTube channel. And so just to refresh your memory, day 1 was about general assessment and grading principles. Day 2 was about differentiation. And day 3 was focused on descriptive feedback and ways to address plagiarism and cheating. So throughout our learning journey, Rick Wormley has demonstrated his expertise and insights with humor and professionalism. I also wanted to point out that Rick is also a trendsetter because, as you will notice, if you look at Rick's screen, he is wearing a shirt on top of a shirt. So that is going to be the new trend, the quarantine trend, a shirt on top of a shirt. All right. Just thinking before I turn it over to Rick, I just wanted to talk about the idea that when it comes to professional learning, oftentimes it takes a moment or several moments for us to reflect, to truly internalize the concepts that we're taught and to put them into practice. After 3 info-packed webinars, we were aware that many of you have lingering questions, and Rick is here today to fully address them so you can continue moving forward in your assessment journey. And so please welcome Rick Wormley for burning questions.
I don't know about fully addressing them, but I'll give it a good shot.
All right. So just to give some background, on April 7th, we had started this learning professional series by inviting Rick and Tom to speak to Alberta school leaders about considerations for assessment and grading in a pandemic online world. And so if you use the bit.ly link that I shared earlier, you can access this slide presentation, and all the presentations are hyperlinked. Or likewise, you can also go to our ERLC YouTube channel to see all of those presentations. After that initial conversation, we addressed many of the questions that school leaders had across Alberta. And at that point, then we started to look at sessions that would help teachers navigate through this complex new world that we find ourselves in. And so one of the things we noticed when we asked the survey for this particular session is that many of you may have not necessarily participated in all 3. So we did get a series of questions about how do we gauge the authenticity of student work. So those questions, we have made the link. So Rick, would you mind just hovering above the hyperlink? So. Okay. If you click on that, it will go directly to the recorded webinar series that addresses those questions. So Rick, if you could advance to the next slide, please.
Okay, is that okay? Yeah, don't revisit it. Here comes the second one.
And we also noticed that in the survey for your burning questions, there were also a number of questions about feedback. So again, what we did was we took those questions and we grouped them so that we could see that we've already addressed them in the webinar. So again, if you access this presentation, you can simply just go on the link because you'll see that that will hyperlink right to the video that answers the questions that were asked. Okay. And we also had a number of questions about how do we differentiate online. And the next slide. And we also had some general questions about assessment. So you can see that all 3 of the webinars are linked in this presentation. And again, I will be sharing that link in the chat box as well. So I just put it in there now. So if you want a copy of the presentation that has all the hyperlinks, feel free to go to that. All right, so we received a number of questions regarding general assessment principles. And so given the amount of time that we have today, we only have an hour, I'm going to limit Rick to only no more than 3 minutes per question. And we'll try our best to get to as many as we can.
All right.
So, first one is about redos and retakes. Do you need to allow a redo, or can you just reassess the outcome again and throw out the previous assignment?
Well, it's really interesting because you have to decide what that really is. Just to reassess again is a redo. There has to be the relearning before the reassessing. So you have to build that time in, that facilitation, whatever that is. But if you're given, in whatever method you use, you're given new evidence that shows a higher level of performance, and you have to decide, sometimes you formally do that. It's very purposeful, it's planned, and sometimes it's surprise. They didn't know it here, but suddenly in the meaningful context of a later unit, you're like, whoa, they do know it. Are you going to be attentive to that and be willing to go back and change the grade? Now, there's an advantage sometimes to keep the historical record. They were once here, and they progressed like this, and that's okay. But ultimately, it's transcript time. At the end of the school year, what evidence do I have? And what we've learned from assessment and grading experts around the world is that you do grade in a trend. The most recent evidence is the most accurate, the most indicative. So you can do a formal one, and I would suggest that you're very proactive. You look for the opportunities to do that, but you can also just reassess based on an outcome that is indicative of a higher level performance. The weird thing, though, to consider is, what if you get rock solid evidence that the child did not carry it forward? Well, this is a reminder that you go back to your original principles, and your principles are the most recent evidence is the most accurate. So if I say a child is competent, is proficient, but he is not, and the evidence is saying he is not, then that's distorting the truth. And we're all about accurate communication. So I might need to lower the grade. Now, in that case, I would probably want to have enough calendar left in the year, time left, to go back and work with that child to try to get him back up to some level of proficiency or higher. So always remember, it's the most recent stuff that's most accurate, but your ultimate guide is, I have the whole year to get this done. And more schools, because of remote instruction, are realizing that even at the end of the year, it's a temporary indicator along a continuum. So if they subsequently, over the summer or even into the next school year, give evidence of previous year knowledge, they're coming up with mechanisms to submit like a grade change report form, some kind of transcript request, to go back and change the grade from earlier. Because really our goal is to teach so they learn, not to say you learn by one date or not, and now I document how you fall short. It's a mindset, it's a fundamental change. So the quick answer is, yes, you can do either one of those, and you can throw out the long ago evidence, because the most recent evidence is the most ethical and accurate. Does that help?
Okay. Yes, thanks. Okay, so the next two questions are related. They want to know basically what would be the best way to communicate to parents and to students on a progress report about the formative assessment that they're doing, because obviously when you have a system like Power School, it is limited in terms of how it communicates that information to parents, because oftentimes we have to put in a grade of some sort. And so how do we express, how do we best communicate that to parents and students, that our emphasis is on the learning with formative assessment?
Right. Well, one of the things you're going to do is you're going to actually train mom and dad on what does it mean to be ethical, and what is assessment versus grading versus feedback. I mean, overtly actually do parent training at evening online or gathered face-to-face when we eventually get back in our buildings, but we actually bring them in. We actually share articles with them, chapters of some people's books that we're all studying as a faculty. It's legit to do that, because then they'll talk about what's happening in schools knowledgeably, rather than people in the community arguing from myth or misconception. So I think bring them into as much training as you can. Secondly, you decide your assessment grading principles first, and then you find the technology to support that. And you flex with the technology to do it. You do not subordinate your principles because you don't think technology can do it. It can. We're at the future we used to dream about. So please live up to that. What I found is when people say, well, we're not sure we can do that with Power School, or Infinite Campus, or Canvas, or Jump Rope, or Skyward, or whatever you're using, I go to the tech coordinators and I ask about that, and they say, oh yeah, you can do that. Nobody's ever asked me to enable that function. Or it's school policy not to do that. But if you change the policy, we can change the tech to support it. Now, I have not found any software, so any electronic gradebook, electronic learner management system of any sort that doesn't have tools built in to communicate with home, parent portal, parent view, whatever that is. So some schools want to be very mindful of this, and they have a running chyron, at the bottom. Every time you go online to look at your child's grades, it reminds them in a statement what's formative and what's summative, extremely clearly. They might color code, red formative, green for summative, like for go, like a traffic light. Oftentimes, I can take my mouse, using my cell phone here for that, or my smartphone, and then move it over, and the cursor, when it moves over an assignment, there's a text box that pops up. And in that text box is an audio file of my commentary, because vocal inflection and tone, I can reveal feedback that is understood. I can post online tutorials that actually might better teach the thing I was trying to get across the student. I can show the evaluative criteria, very specific things. I can do a screencastify link where I'm circling things and talking about it. It might link to Google Docs where we can kind of enter into something together as we work together. All the normal tools we would use to get a message across to mom and dad, we avail ourselves of that. But specifically with descriptive feedback and formative assessment, how they're progressing, we are very, very clear. This is coming to know. So that must be a safe place to wrestle and not have it be high stakes, which means there's no judgment, which means I need to talk to mom and dad about how evaluation and judgment actually inhibit learning and critical error analysis. So they're on board with that. And then, as I've mentioned in some of the previous sessions, I need to train them in descriptive feedback techniques so they can use it at home themselves and see the value of that. And I have 2 videos on YouTube on that. They're available on my website, which is on the last slide of this presentation. You're welcome to go use that as one of the first steps to kind of get these tools in parents' hands. But the idea at every turn is that mom and dad gets more communication that's helpful in their own work with kids and at least monitoring where children are, not, I have an 87, but I have no idea how I got an 87, or I got a 37. Oh no, what do I do now? So there are lots of tools in our software. We can avail ourselves of it. And to be honest, a lot of kids actually know a lot of the apps already. Flipgrid is a wonderful way to communicate and explain what's going on. Here's my thinking about what's going on. I would say, hey, mom and dad, let's train you on Flipgrid so you know what's going on and your students can use that as well. Does that help? I'm open.
I think so, yes. And our final question is, how do we ensure that our assessments are conducive to deep learning and not just an easy Google search? And even so, how do we ensure that our assessments will engage our students who can't do a quick Google search?
Well, in the seminar that we did on minimizing cheating and so on, we gave lots of ideas on how you make much more complex assignments. For example, I might say, describe how this premier handled the economy during this particular group of years versus this premier, how they described it. Well, that's just point and really just cut and paste plagiarize without remorse off the internet. But if I said, here are 4 economic principles, rank those in order of importance to this premier versus the ranking to this earlier premier. Now you can't just take somebody else's information and rearrange it and claim it as your own. So now you have to do something. You have to take a stance on it. So the idea that you would really get into what's not just being a parrot, being an echo of others, and what is thinking with agility, versatility, flexible thinking, and doing the thing where, yes, I answer formulaically, but then my teacher says, well, what if I inserted this variable? How would you change your response in that previous question? You want to get good at being able to do this sort of thing. And that comes from talking to each other. What's just basic minimum rote recall versus really applying it in unique ways, handling novelties and curveballs? We have so many students in North America that are graduating very good. If you give me this one situation with these exact parameters, I can respond, but you add anything to that and I'm lost. I can't respond. So what we do is we make sure we teach models in science and models in science and math and models of writing, but then how to use hybrids of 2 or 3 models or toss the models to the wind because they don't serve. It's kind of like you look at a situation and you want to ask kids, what questions will we need to ask before we even able to do the math to resolve or solve the problem. That's hugely marketable, but it's not an easily measurable standardized test for the province. And so those things don't always get asked, but they're probably among the more important questions, is what questions do I need to ask before I actually begin to resolve it? So we did talk about some resources and some really good ideas about, one, calibrating with each other what is evidentiary of real, the essential outcomes, and which really extended and versatile, so on. And then what is, how do we calibrate that with each other? So identifying it, taking it further, getting training in how do you develop assessment prompts, really good use of time. That would also mean a cultivation of one's own creative. A lot of teachers aren't used to really pushing the envelope, really up beyond what are like 15 ways to assess the same thing. I think there's only one or two, and that might be something you want to kind of feed yourself intellectually as well.
Okay, thanks. And especially as we head into September and having relatively not knowing what is going to happen in the fall with regards to students, whether they return back to school or not, we may be having to look at some of those alternative ways of assessing learning, so that it is responsive if in the event that we do have to do an online or a blended learning platform.
Yeah, more than likely, you're spot on.
Right. Okay, so if you go to the next slide. We also had a number of questions regarding to culture shift. So we do have some school leaders who were asking, how do we support staff with moving them along in understanding sound assessment practices? Because it is, when we talk about assessment, if you asked different people amongst school staff, everyone would have different opinions and perspectives on how to approach it. So how do we approach getting staff to move along in their assessment journey?
Well, I mean, one of the things we did talk about in one of the videos would be a good starting point is to be very clear-minded about the value of assessment and the value of grading, and make sure we're very discerning between the two. Grading is not necessary to learning. You can learn without grades. In fact, grades can get in the way. But assessment is absolute oxygen. It is our vitality. It is life-giving. You can't have good lessons and instruction without good assessment, and vice versa. And you can be far more equitable in these inequitable exacerbations and terrible situations that we're having right now through assessment in ways that grading in more traditional formats does not allow. So know that we're going to get really into assessment, and then start with the common ground. What do we really believe? What's the role of assessment? Is it to gather data so we can make instructional design decisions? We can provide feedback. It can form our next steps. Yeah, absolutely. So then we actually start practicing that. We together will assess the same student products and say, now, how does this speak to us? We might need to study, books on how that happens. How do you analyze student products in light of evaluative criteria? But what we're trying to move towards is that we're evidentiary. So we say, well, this evidence speaks to this. And if we have proficiency skills or scales, what we're trying to do is say, okay, what constitutes a 1 versus a 2 versus a 3? And how are we communicating that to others? And then how does that help us become more informed and therefore more effective in our response? The root of all of this is responsive teaching. And if our assessments don't reveal, they're not revelatory, reveal story, then it's hard to respond. Then we kind of lump kids all together, and it masks patterns that we should be perceiving, but we're not, because we didn't, for example, disaggregate. So if we're trying to help teachers move along, first we have to get them up to speed on what really is assessment and what's its value to our instructional design, feedback, and the growth of the student. And maybe how does it also aid student self-efficacy? Because they need to own this stuff as much as possible. That's going to be even more paramount as we move to more remote instruction, which probably will happen quite a bit of the time next year, even in a blended situation. And then how does that differ from grading? So assessment is all instruction, everything else. But remember, grades are reportive evidence at journey's end, not how you got there. So the different timelines, the different pathways, the different levels of support, that's where assessment has its play. And I want teachers to kind of see that. So the common ground stuff And I found that when anything is divisive, you know, it's a little controversial, you always start with common ground that you hold together. So it'd be like, do you think grades should be accurate? Do you think teachers should be knowledgeable about the students they serve? And that should have a play in what happens in the classroom or, you know, online. Am I going to find out about the students and then take that so they have a definite seat at learning's table? They have a role to play here. And we create kind of a mutual ethos. I'm looking out for you, you're looking out for me. That happens through the assessment. And then this entire fact, every time that proper assessment grading has not worked, it's because what I have found is that the leadership did not spend enough time building capacity to move to that. They just changed the program and the procedures without changing beliefs. And Anthony Muhammad, who's a wonderful educational leader, transformative school leadership and learning, and many others have said, that's a willful act of failure. You're on purpose trying to sabotage. So I do have, and I do training on this. And what I would do is, you don't need to hire me. I'll just send you the PowerPoint with the talking points. It's okay, let me know. But I have these ideas on how do you build capacity for the shift to ethical, accurate grading measures, particularly during this time. And it's just idea after idea after idea. One of the first things people do in the first year, though, is define the terms and create a common lexicon, because when you share a common vocabulary, you speed up the cultural shift. And then you begin to look at scenarios. If this was our principle that we understood about grading, how is that manifest in what we do, or are we hypocrites? Another resource to you is chapter 2 in a book I wrote called Fair Isn't Always Equal, 2nd edition. And it's about 20 or so of these principles of assessment and grading and teaching. And then if you weren't a hypocrite, what are 5 or 6 things you'd be doing so you had integrity? And a lot of times teachers say, I want integrity. I want my grades to mean what they say. Great. What are we doing to muddy the waters and mess that up? Let's stop doing that. And what are we doing that clarify the waters, that really allow us to represent with integrity, your child is here, and here's the helpful information you can use to work with your child. That's going to go a long way. So looking at teachers' ethics of it, not just getting burrowed down in the mechanics of it, because we can get lost in that. So the basic premise is kind of becoming principled first, actionable or practical second, and then really rallying around the evidence that we are truly evidentiary in what we do might be great first steps. I would be glad to give some of those other suggestions via the PowerPoint if anybody emails me.
Perfect. If you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide, Rick.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Right. So a lot of the pieces that Rick talked about are captured in this framework that I created called Normalizing Talk Routines. So if we're talking about really moving an entire staff forward, one of the things you have to ask yourself is, do we create a culture of thinking for educators? Do your staff meetings and your staff gatherings allow opportunities for teachers to talk about their instructional practice? So if you look at all of the icons, you'll see that many of the pieces in this framework do support a framework that moves forward instructional practice. So do discussions focus on improving student achievement? Does everybody have the same understanding of consistent language? So when we say the words formative assessment, does everyone have the same understanding of that? Are there talk routines in place that emphasize collective problem solving? It's not about judgment or deciding who's a better teacher or not. It's about really working together to ensure that everyone is trying to help each other out in moving forward. Also, are there opportunities for reflective practice? And does everyone have a growth mindset? We oftentimes talk about growth mindsets with students, but do teachers also believe that that failure is a natural part of learning, and being able to embody explicit discussions about times when we've been successful in the classroom or times when we failed? Common group norms and also cognitive coaching. Do staff have the abilities to pose questions that allow for others to reflect? And do you have opportunities to share growth and success stories? And so if anyone is interested in this particular graphic, you can also email me at susan.wu@erlc.ca. But it's also in the slide presentation that I shared in the bit.ly link earlier.
Thank you for that, Susan. This is just perfect. What a great framework from which to work. And you made me think about something too, that these assessment grading principles are universal. I do training for pre-kindergarten, preschool, at very early grade levels, all the way up through college professors, and in career and technical schools and colleges, universities, and so on, and everybody in between. And one of the ways we found that's really helpful for teachers to see the benefits is that we employ the exact same principles when we evaluate and work with them. So if we do instructional coaching with them, for example, or cognitive coaching, and they feel the positives, they're way more likely to take those elements and do it with their students. They want to extend that. So if we say to them, well, how would you like to be assessed and evaluated, and your salary based on it, that sort of thing? What would you tolerate? What would you not tolerate is indicative of your performance as a teacher, that sort of thing. Then we say, oh, great. And we do that with them. And then they say, oh, this is appropriate to do with students as well. So if you would not tolerate it being applied to you in your evaluation, then it probably doesn't make sense to do that with morphing insecure humans. So I want to do descriptive feedback techniques, or I want my teachers to do that. I will do the same techniques with teachers. And then they feel like, oh, what is that? I'm trying it on, it's experiential. They're way more likely to internalize that and want to extend that to others. You can also say this, how are teachers, or how is anybody in any profession evaluated and assessed? And then point out the parallels between that, how they're assessed, and what we're doing with this ethical accurate grading. And then also ask them, and ask any profession, how did you learn your craft? Really, every minutia, every moment, all the way through the most profound, and point out again the parallels between that and what we're doing with ethical accurate grading, because you find way more parallels to working world preparation, the post-high school world preparation with what we're talking about than you do with traditional grading. We very rarely average somebody's earlier incompetence with their current competence. It really goes a long way to, a sense, get buy-in that, oh, this is far more impactful in a positive way for what students will actually face when they leave our classrooms. Hope that helps.
Great, thanks, Rick.
Okay.
Moving on to the next slide. Our next we also received a set of questions related to trying to create student motivation. Because obviously with the lack of person-to-person connection, many teachers are finding that it's difficult to motivate their students when they're learning online. So what advice do you have in regards to trying to get students to become more engaged and motivated about their learning when we are looking at a supporting learning at home scenario?
I would really, really like to have about a day and a half, please. Could you just add that in?
Unfortunately, you only have 3 minutes.
This is absolutely huge. So let me just get this out before I, get in flow and forget it. I did a webinar on this recently with Leanne Nicholson, and it's on my website as a recording. So if you want to go to rickwormley.com and just go to the multimedia section, you will see it there. I think the first title though is COVID-19, and then it's about getting kids motivated while doing remote instruction or learning from home. Something like, to just know you have that if you want to do that. The second thing I want to get across to you is that there's no such thing as laziness. Please realize what a myth that is, that we are hardwired from birth to want to do demanding things, to want to belong, to want to please others, to really do complex things. And so when a child manifests what looks like apathy or laziness or disinterest, there's always something else going on that you can't see, or you can see but can't control. A lot of kids want to mask that in hopes you won't find out that they don't really belong. Why should I give the world more ammunition that I'm worthy of rejection? When I have a child in remote learning or online or in classroom, and they spend 30 minutes doing something really challenging, like a puzzle, a math problem, a conclusion, but it rocks, and they're filled with dopamine, a moderate sense of euphoria. The dopamine is a motivation neurotransmitter. And there are lots of things that actually release dopamine. One is goal setting. to do that. And then one is goal monitoring. Look how I'm actually progressing. And one is goal achieving. There's a little drips of the dopamine going in the body, and there's a physiological pleasure moment where we actually, hey, I like this, I want more of it. Well, when we do that stuff, I walk over to a child who spent 30 minutes working so hard, they finally achieved, and the number one response I get back is, give me another one. I love, this is great. They want more of that. So we have actually identified what helps kids invest in their learning. So that's self-efficacy, it's executive function, to own the learning. We comment on decisions. We don't comment on the quality of the work because that invokes ego and then self-preservation, and they shut down. We establish relationships. We do things like really emphasize complex carbohydrates and proteins and sleep, because those things actually create motivational releases in the human body, physiology. Laughter does that. A sense of humor does that. We create a sense of relationship as we can with remote instruction. That's going to become even more paramount. But we don't rely on grades for the motivation, for the fear of that. So one of the things, if I have a student who's not really achieving higher, I have to first accept this is unnatural, because the natural state is curiosity and desperately wanting to learn. This is the way humans are built, unless there's damage by forceps at birth or oxygen deprivation, right? So I'm not going to accept that as the true person that is talking to me. I'm going to try to address what are these things that are keeping the child from being his genuine self. And it might be sleep deprivation, which changes personality. Families are very dysfunctional. Maybe there's incredibly intense anxiety, panic anxiety disorders. There's an article on the website I just came out this year where I talk about how schools need to speak to the rising anxiety and panic disorders, and that's going to be a way to get them back invested in the learning. So we start with a very strong why of why would you want to set higher goals? You're interested in this, what is it? Do I need to get to know my students better so I can figure out what would rock their world? If they could do analogies between anime and manga cartoons and this thing, or ice fishing in this thing, or basketball in this thing. I mean, I will do whatever it takes. A favorite TV show, a culture. If they're going to do a TikTok as a way to demonstrate evidence of something, because that's just kind of the way they roll, they move, I'm all for it, man. I want to engage. And one of the things that's been huge in this is student agency. I'm in the middle of writing a new article on this. I'll be glad to send you excerpts, rough drafts, of how do you help kids develop voice and choice in their own learning. But if you would do a search on student agency and how to develop it, you'll get so many articles, so many research pieces. And I would suggest maybe going to DC, D-E-C-I, and Ryan. DC and Ryan are the two last names of the researchers, and they're on self-determination theory as a way to help kids kind of figure out how to invest in their learning. And that was the basis for Dan Pink's Drive, which is probably one of the best go-to books for teachers to invest in and how to get kids to be motivated in their own work. I'll leave it at that, but I will be glad to send you some of those resources if you were to email me afterwards.
Okay, thanks, Rick.
Oh, sorry, I'm the one moving the slide.
That's right.
I need to maintain my responsibility here.
Okay, we also had a group of questions related to feedback. And so do you have any strategies to provide feedback for ELL language acquisitions within assignments?
I am not quite certain why that is different than the feedback techniques that we were discussing in that, but added to that, the normal ways you provide feedback when we're in the classroom. So now what we're talking about is how do you do it remotely? But I don't have a different one other than everything we've outlined, except I do a training on how do you work with ELL in the regular classroom. And we didn't really talk about that. And in there, I do talk about ways of interacting with ELLs that might be really beneficial. So I guess what I might say is, let's try, maybe an email on that and how you do that. Like, how do you do certain translations and things like that? Yes, of course. And I'm a big believer in PSYOP and sheltered instruction approaches. You may or may not be comfortable with those. But what we found is meaningful instruction in their own language, the language becomes more important to them to make the English translations. If English is it might be French, of course, because of dual language in your school. But whatever it is, learning a topic in their own language, their own cultural focus, makes it faster to develop the language acquisitions in the language that's trying to be taught to them. Because we start making the substitutions as we go back and forth and doing it. It doesn't work just to teach everything in English or French or whatever the language is you're trying to get across to them. So if you would like, I can send those to you. But when it comes specifically to feedback, in whatever way works, and that includes non-linguistic. Many of you know Bob Marzano, classroom instruction that works. It was kind of gave it a new life, a new breath in our education world when he identified that as one of the top 9 things you can do. So if you're constantly over-reliant on linguistic representation of content and knowledge and feedback in particular, you might want to consider some non-linguistic versions of that. How can I do performance demonstrations and diagrams and graphic performance of feedback? And it might be simple as the student, when I'm doing feedback, one of the things you do is you compare your work to evaluative criteria or to an exemplar given. So if I can do that graphically, I will try to do that graphically if I need to in the moment, because I'm really going to focus on content and learning, not point out how they're very limited in how they're responding back to me or I am to them. If that makes sense.
Perfect. I know ESL consultant Carol Salva, who's out of Texas, is also, she does a lot of webinars about supporting ELLs during to support online learning as well. So that's someone else you could also look up. Our next question is, it's actually very common for Division I teachers because oftentimes the instructions are not necessarily going directly to the students, but rather to the parents instead. So this teacher's question is, how demanding can they be or should they be with feedback, given that the students are in grade 1 and it's basically the parents that will have to provide the follow-up with specific instruction? So because the feedback is,
you know, how demanding. I don't actually see feedback as demanding at all, because that would suggest to me that you're saying you should, and I need you to do this. That's not what feedback is. That's a myth about feedback. So you're setting expectations. Those can be demanding. Those can be challenging. But remember what feedback is from the training we did on that. This is me asking questions and doing experiences, facilitating where the child comes to the conclusion. So if you're asking me, how pushy should I be in getting the kids to kind of look at his or her own work? You're exactly right that we could actually fry a lot of brain cells with early learners, young learners, if we are overly emphasizing this. I need you to go back and look at your mistakes. But it's not a mindset of I'm pointing out your wrongness and now you've got to go back and make corrections. Going back and making corrections, that's not what the feedback is initially. That's the action, of course, that comes as a result of feedback. So the idea that we can be very gentle, very civil, and one of the things we do is we realize in cognitive science that most grade 1s, grade 2s, kindergarten, they have about 6 to 7 minutes of focused attention, and then their mind wanders. So if I'm doing any activity, I would want to change it up. 5, 6, 7 minutes of doing this, change to something else, and then come back. When you get older, like into middle school and upper school or high school, it's about 10 to 15 minutes. You could probably stretch to 20, and then you want to shift as much as you can. You don't want to belabor it. You don't want it to become dysfunctional between you. So one of the things I've realized is I've realized, you know, 1 of 3 decisions. Is this so fundamental, I cannot move forward at all until the child, by golly, masters this? Or is it, you know, it's just nice to know, but it's not a battle I want to choose. It's not really that important. Or, you know what? Right here, right now, it's not working, but we are going to visit this next week or the week after, and I can let it go until then. That's fine. But remember what feedback is. We're entering into collaboration. Like, for example, I might ask questions or give some kind of starter prompts to which I don't even know the answer. And the child's going to have a little voice and choice about which direction they go in that. That's that world of feedback. And we did list some of those starters in that video, if you'd like to do that. So I'm hoping that people would not see it as demanding, but they would see it as coaching and very supportive. And it comes across as advocating all the time, not playing gotcha. I caught you making mistakes. I've pointed it out. Here's how you have to shape up and fly right. That would be a misunderstanding of what feedback is. Operate from that principle. Maybe you could have some good responses. I hope.
Okay, great. And now moving to the other end of the spectrum, if we look at older teachers, on older grade levels, this person is teaching 5 full-time classes of language arts, which is quite a heavy load. And oftentimes, as you know, as an ELA teacher yourself, it takes a long time to come up with quality descriptive feedback. So this teacher wants to know what are some tips you would have regarding the time management of providing feedback?
Yeah, I've got nothing. Next question. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. This is a huge thing. It's perennial, and it's a sign of an overwhelming curriculum. Some of you know Bob Marzano's wonderful, just stunning statistic that he and his associates figured out that it would take 23 years to teach all of the learner outcomes we have set up for K-12 if we were to do justice to all of them. So one of the first things you want to do is, hey, let's provide feedback on only the most essential at first as we get more and more comfortable with it. And we'll try to do some of the secondary ones as we can. And in any one school year, or discipline for a school year, usually is about 4 to 8 power standards, leveraging standards, the most pivotal of standards. Feedback's going to rally around them the most, and we're not going to feel guilt when we don't do the rest. Second, what I found from Vicki Spandell and Rick Stiggins in their research, and it served me well, is that most students, when they get feedback, really only internalize feedback on about 2 areas within a project, a test, a paper, a performance. So if I give feedback on every single element, it's just going to get the glazed eye, and it's just going to go right over their heads. And I spent all that time, and they're not even going to pay attention to it. That's a problem. I'm also going to emphasize that I'm going to write feedback in such a way, or say it out loud in such a way as to invite the kid, the student, to come into his own learning. So I am not going to do the heavy lifting myself, which takes more time. So I'm going to do the dot thing, if you remember that from the seminar, or put a dot where there's an issue and teach the child to find the mistake based on the knowledge that there is one there in the sentence, the paragraph, in the math problem, in the science lab write-up, or I'm going to highlight what it is. But the student is going to do the larger version. Now, what does that mean too? I'm going to shorten my assignments. I have found that when I do a 3 or 4 page assignment in a language arts class at high school, middle school level, or longer, it takes me 22 hours to give feedback on every single one of the 185 students I serve when I'm in the classroom. I don't have that time. I have a 45-minute planning period every single day when we're back in the building. And certainly with remote instruction, things are almost 24/7. So I can't possibly do that. So I've shortened it. Pascal said if I had more time, I would have written less. So I decided that I could tell what you know in 1 page of really good writing, cogent writing, than I can in 3 or 4 pages of lazy writing. So I assigned 1 and 2 pagers, mostly at secondary level, but boy, every word counts. Every sentence advances your cause or it's tossed. And this is a higher order thinking skill. And what happens is I get through the stacks faster and the kids get it in their hands. And what we found is kind of a 1 to 3 day window of if I get the feedback within about 1 to 3 days, I will listen to it. I will internalize it, and I will not make those mistakes again. I'll grow from it. But when they get it like a week or more later, it just is like, what's the grade? I got to move on because I am so past that. And that's kind of where their egos are. So less is more would be kind of a wonderful way to look at this. And then the last thing I'll tell you real quickly is this. If you are the one giving feedback, you're a bottleneck if you're the sole provider of feedback. What I decided I had to do, and it works so well, and I've coached other teachers in this, is I teach students the feedback techniques, How do I give feedback to myself? How do I self-monitor? All those strategies out there that John Hattie's talked about from meta-analysis is powerful. Bob Marzano talks about, a lot of people talk about self-monitoring. Then I teach mom and dad how to give feedback to students, and then classmate to classmate, how do they give feedback? So it's not just me doing the feedback. Otherwise, learning only happens when I'm around, and that's not self-efficacy, and that's not moving kids from dependence to independence. So if you can open that up to broaden the repertoire of who is providing the feedback to the student, it will serve you well. Hope those help.
Right, for sure. It would be definitely the gradual release of responsibility, where initially you're modeling how to provide feedback, and once they understand the language that you're using, then over time the idea is to make them do it. And it might be easier with peer editing because it's easier to look at somebody else's piece of writing and then over time at their own writing as well.
Right. And remember, when a student analyzes somebody else's stuff, they are totally thinking about themselves and what they do in this same effort. So it's actually an overt act of direct instruction to give feedback to a classmate. You're not like slowing things down. You're not ruining momentum. You're speeding up long-term retention.
Right. So if we could go to the next slide. One other tip I also had as a language arts teacher is that I would also restrict the feedback. I would give only 2 revising and 1 editing comment at any given time, because otherwise it's just unmanageable if you're providing feedback literally about everything. Okay, our next set of questions were related to online strategies. And so many of these, I believe, were addressed in your previous session, but how do you support courses or objectives that require hands-on learning? So it's not a paper and pen task that would be easily necessarily assessed online, or demonstrating thinking, for example, in a math classroom where they have to show their thinking.
Well, one of the things that I think is a missed opportunity is the use of metaphors and analogies. I wrote a whole book on it. It's the world of cognitive linguistics is what I'm drawing upon. And so I will talk to you more about it if you'd like more specifics about it. But what we're talking about is, how do I manifest abstract ideas in a physical, project or physical object of some sort? And that capacity to use manipulatives to represent, you can do that all the way through the highest levels, the most advanced courses, and the most fundamental. Little kids can take a crayon and think it's a sword, or they substitute one thing in place of another. So the cognitive science and metaphor, where I compare one thing in one domain in terms of another thing in another domain, is huge. And it leads to so many mini epiphanies of meaningful learning. Like I'm recoding something I'm learning here that's new in terms of something familiar. So we can talk about that a lot. But then it becomes, all right, if I teach kids about metaphors and analogies, then we got to begin to think about, well, what's valuable? Tactile, really being able to touch it stuff, hands-on learning. I've got to think creatively. And again, if you're not used to thinking and being pushed to the limits and outside of your comfort zone and creativity and divergent thinking, this is harder. But it gets so much easier when you cultivate your creative self just for its own sake. I mean, seriously, I'm talking about just do puzzles every day. Learn a new instrument you've never played before. That forced creativity and problem solving is help you when you look at your content, your curriculum, your assessment things. And then you begin to work with others who will help ping ideas off of each other. For example, we found more and more schools are beginning to think about, well, we actually have this lab stuff. And what we're going to do is we're going to rotate kids coming in where there's only 3 to 5 kids in the room at a time. They're wearing masks and maybe one adult supervisor, and they're building with the tools of the school's resources that are only available in the school. Well, maybe that's not available, but they have a community center that has an arts and crafts center or an engineering or welding school or something along those lines. And we get the kids to have some slots in there to kind of build some of the stuff. But we're also going to think about, you know what? Normally I would tell kids to go buy styrofoam balls for this model thing we're going to build, or 2-liter bottles because we're going to make lungs and we're going to squeeze them and we're going to see the balloons go in and out as we do this stuff. Wait a minute, what else could I use that's around the house? And during that time, one of my best pieces of advice is I would ask a subset of kids, I want to be able to do this, but I wonder, how could I do it with other materials that maybe we don't all have universally? And we can make a list, a menu of options, try it this way, try it that way. And of course, then some of the hands-on things, I might be able to manipulate with 3D models with a lot of the graphic software that's out there, and that's the best I can do. Maybe there's demonstrations of it on YouTube or museum channels or tutorials online in lieu of the hands-on. But I know how powerful hands-on is. So sometimes I'll do this. I'm thinking about metaphors and analogies. I know I'll have them use their bodies in frozen tableau to portray X. And it was just using their bodies to figure it out. They're into their bodies. I might as well use that for good and not evil. Kids can do finger plays of mitosis during of chromosomes during mitosis and meiosis as they pull apart. They could say this is the ratio of something to something. A hinge. They could say this debate hinges on something. We can connect it to the body if we need to. There's lots of ways to kind of think outside the box and invite kids in on how to do that. But to say, I can't use hands-on learning when it's remote instruction from home would be a mistake. You really, really, really can. Does that help? I don't know.
Right, and it definitely does demonstrate conceptual understanding if they don't necessarily stick with the defined parameters of the original idea, because you have to transfer that. What is it like? What are the properties or features that are similar or different if you're going to create a metaphor or an analogy?
Yeah, and some of you know Gene Feldman wrote a wonderful book, From Molecule to Metaphor. And that's just one of wonderful books. And it's every science element concept that's taught K-12, at least most of them. And what metaphors people have been using that are wrong, and what new metaphors can you use to teach it correctly. So if you teach science at any level, you will thank me by getting From Molecule to Metaphor. My book is Metaphors and Analogies, Power Tools for Teaching Any Subject. If you could get into that world, you would probably open up a lot of cool possibilities for hands-on learning, or at least the physical learning of abstract ideas you need to teach.
Okay, thanks. If you could advance to the next slide, please.
Yeah, sorry, I'm really into flow. Is that the, yeah, that's the,
yes.
Yeah, that's that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. And so we also had a number of questions that were bigger picture questions. And so the first one I think is on everyone's mind, and we expect you to have the definitive answer, Rick. Do you think that education is going to evolve, or do you think we will return to our same ways, and what education will look like in the future because of the pandemic?
I think it will evolve, but it depends on political fortitude and the degree to which you're willing to tolerate hypocrisy. We all negotiate that with ourselves every single day, but I don't think we're going to be able to go back. What do you mean? In particular, looking at curriculum, we're going to start culling the stuff that was just nice to know. We were padding it. It's political suicide to say we're going to take away some of the curriculum from teachers that they have to teach, because it looks like we're going soft on teachers. Look, they get their summers off, which we know is a complete lark and inappropriate. However, that's the way a lot of people outside think it. I think we're going to have new respect for what teachers do. So that's going to be very supportive. But for a long time, because the economy, we're not going to have the money to really support all we need to do. So to do that, we are probably going to have to do a lot more remote instruction, even when we're back in the classroom, to kind of fill in a lot of the gaps along the way. I do think brick and mortar colleges, universities are really going to be questioning some stuff, because if I could sit in a lecture and learn this stuff and get my degree, then why do I need to pay for the college experience? So we're going to have to talk about, how does that college experience, being away from home for 4 years and interacting with the big ideas of life and kind of creating your own identity, how is that still valuable? I also am realizing that, as I just mentioned moments ago, relationship building is going to be even harder when we don't have the students physically together at the beginning of the year. And that is going to have such new importance with rising anxieties and the oppressive nature of uncertainty, that we are going to have to take a harder look at that about what we do. I also think it's because this has revealed so many exasperations, some inequities and things like that, that we're going to go gulp, we were complacent. We swept things under the rug, and we can no longer do that. But it's going to take communities really stepping up. And I think parents have become more informed. So I think it will evolve in those areas. But I think if you say school will look like this a year from now, you're not being prudent, because the moment we decide it's going to look like that, we need to be open to the fact that it will probably likely change. And so we have to get very comfortable with rapidly changing things and the demanding nature of that. So I also think as kids get older in high school and college, we're going to do more micro credentialing, which means I will take a 6-month class on this, or 18-month on that, or a 2-month on that, and I will get training in, I don't know, C++ or whatever it is in software. I'll get training in graphic design. I'll get training in this, and eventually they're going to start pulling together their own kind of diplomas, satisfied within certain categories. And so the training somebody will get in high school or college will be a little bit different than somebody else, and that will be very, very marketable down the road.
Right, for sure. Okay, I'm going to skip the second question because I believe we already addressed it earlier.
I would agree. Yeah.
So the next one is, what are the most effective and efficient ways to collect evidence to inform next year's teacher of the student's standing? Because as you know, many of Alberta teachers are focusing on essential learning outcomes, because obviously it's more difficult to cover the full curriculum. And so how can we best support that transition to next year? Because we already know there are going to be gaps because of inequity of access to learning that's happening right now. So what would be the best way for teachers to communicate what has been covered?
Well, just a reminder, the operative principle here is that we're going to have to become familiar with the previous year's curriculum when we accept these new students in the fall. And we're going to have to know the next year's curriculum. And because we know the larger context and where they came from, we can make connections between all that, and we're far more effective in our current curriculum. But it does mean we'll have to do the heavy lifting and say, I'm going to let this go because it's just nice to know, and I don't have room in my curriculum because I'm adding in a few things from the previous year. I also think that every current year teacher, so your teacher right now, is probably going to need to prepare very quickly, like a 1 to 2 page document. It's electronic, digital, I know, that will follow the individual student and say, in 4th quarter, we only got to this stuff. Here's what we left off. Please know this as that student enters your class, and also realize it might be very imperfect, very intermittent retention over the summer. There is going to be loss. And so you're probably going to have to weave that into what you're doing, but not expect it to be already there as a foundation. And the previous 3 quarters of the year, that stuff is usually kind of solidified the last 4th quarter or last trimester, and we didn't get a chance to do that. So the idea that we would have to prepare a document that would just be attached to anything sent forward, this is literally what we taught in this subject, and we sit down and do that, and it might be different for different kids. We're making this up, and that's going to be one of the clearest ways that teachers have something on which to work, an early palette from which to draw to create instructional design. But they're going to have to be open to that. It also means that almost all learner management systems I have seen, and online software, does have capacity for you to type in notes about the kids. And it could be an audio file if you're just tired of typing, to explain, here's where we are, while we're doing this stuff, when you want to become informed about the child. So avail yourself of the normal tools, but also be very conscientious of what you would like, if as you have students coming in, of what you like to prepare for next year's teachers, because your commitment as a conscientious educator is to the success of the students beyond your classroom. And many schools are thinking about e-portfolios that will follow you from year to year. And whatever age you are, grade level you are, when you demonstrate learning, you get the credit for that. And a school might strongly consider having science collected works for multiple grade levels that just follow, and then the teacher merely has to go look at the e-portfolio to kind of see where they are. We're very short of time, but that's my initial response.
Right, and there's definite value in a teacher also knowing what they should have learned the previous year, because it helps them understand the instructional scaffolding that's required. So if they know there already are gaps, then they'll definitely have to be pieces in play in September, where they'll have to do a little bit more review from the previous year in order to help scaffold them to the current year's curriculum, if that's necessary.
And it doesn't have to be sequential. I mean, you could just say, look, this is a really cool thing that I need to bring forward from the previous year. I could make it connected to this thing up here, like lateral, not like it's prerequisite, I can't go anywhere. Kids can actually understand very advanced concepts, very complex, without having every single skill set in it. Remember that learning is much more episodic. It's done in bursts and connections. It's not always done in a linear sequence. Could we be open to that? Absolutely.
Okay, I know we're already at 3 o'clock, but I hope it's okay with everyone if we just take an additional 5 minutes to address that last question.
Okay, what is it?
If in September, teachers and students return to either a fully remote or a blended learning environment, how should teachers plan for assessment practices to ensure that they're getting an accurate picture of their students, where the students are at, and the understanding of the beginning of the year and what considerations there needs to be for the subsequent year?
Yeah, this goes back to what do we understand that is adequate assessment? It goes back to understanding what makes assessment valid. So how do I know I'm getting an adequate picture? You look at your assessment instruments and you remember that it's snapshots over time. It's not one moment in time, because a larger sample size increases accuracy. So I need to do a dipsticking, check the level of the oil in the car. Absolutely. I can do that, but I need to do multiple samples and then take a look at the whole. I can't really analyze that though, unless I'm already mindful of what is evidence of proficiency. So this summer, I would want to, at least with the biggest possible learner essential outcomes or standards, whatever you might call them, I would want to calibrate that with my subject-like colleagues. Hey, what's really, really proficient? What's literate? What's mastery? Whatever we call that. Great, great. So what are the look-fors in our assessments? Great. And then what instruments do we have? And I want a variety of them to be able to elicit that evidence. And then how are we using that data we collect? I see so many teachers collect data and then go write it and do what they were going to do anyway. And there's no impact. So the question that a colleague would ask another, or a principal would ask a teacher, is, how did you take what you knew about the students? First, tell me what you know about them regarding this topic. And then how does it inform your instructional decisions? I want to see that in the lesson designs. Can you show me that? And if the teacher can't make that connection, then that's a moment of pause and say, let's go back and see how assessment informs what we decide to do. But if teachers aren't clear-minded about evidence and calibrating it, it's going to be a wild shot in the dark again. It won't be coherent, and we all want a nice, orderly schematic, at least to the degree this strange emergency teaching allows us to do. Yes, if you don't have that evidence or that coherence, the scope and sequence of what's to come, it's going to be really hard to do it with the individual child. So if at all possible, we get teachers to, and here's the thing, give them some money to do this if at all possible, but if not, you do it by choice if that's what you want to do, if that's something you value as a priority. But you sit down to decide the evidence, and then you really brainstorm the different instruments and then how those instruments would inform what you do. So how do you make sure it's valid? You employ assessment practices of validity. And we did outline a lot of those, but I can send a few more if you like. But if you type in assessment validity, you'll see whole articles and webinars on how do you make something valid as an accurate indicator of student proficiency.
Okay, great.
You want to add something to that, Susan? Because we could talk a long time about that. I'm trying to be truncated.
Right, of course. Well, you and I will continue our conversations, because I will be planning for some assessment sessions with you for the following school year. So I'm thinking of that we might be doing something like a series where you will walk a cohort of teachers throughout the year with their assessment questions and as they start their school year. And
I would love that. That'd be wonderful.
Right. So if you have any further questions, please email Rick directly at rick@rickwormley.onmicrosoft.com. This concludes our Q&A with Rick Wormley. Thank you so much for all your expertise. And I know it's definitely been helpful to have your voice in the background to help guide us in our assessment journey as we started this pandemic journey. And we definitely hope that we will have you back with ERLC for next year. So thank you very much again for your time.
Thank you very much for the honor of letting me help and doing this stuff. It's meaningful to me. I just hope that you got something you could use. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.